I see a lot of solutions to problems in software development that ultimately come down to, oh, well, you're not doing it right. That's why it failed. But at the end of the day, humans are extremely fallible. So the process has to work despite the humans. I think the problem there is that the forcing function isn't strong enough. A lot of companies that we work with are extremely profitable. So in a way, they can tolerate bad software development practices. As I'm sure any bank manager will tell you, you can't live on the never never. Technical debt eventually has to be paid.
Welcome everybody to Getting to Zero, a podcast about uncovering the problems in the product development process and how we can improve them. Our guest today is Rodger, the CEO and co-founder of Voxgig, which is a developer relationships consultancy. Previously, he has been a co-founder of Nearform, one of the world's largest Node.js consultancies. And prior to that, he was the CTO of Feed Henry, a mobile cloud platform. So welcome, Richard.
Hey, Kapuri, good to see you. Thanks for having me here.
Thank you for joining us. I'm going to jump right in with the hairy question that we always ask. What is your number one problem in your software development process? And that means end to end, from coming up with the idea until you've got satisfied customers.
In our world, developer relations, the problem, which might sound a bit odd, is getting buy-in from executive leadership in the value of what we do and the value of what our clients do. So we're helping developer relations teams build better APIs, better portals, better documentation, better communities. And if you've worked in developer relations, or if you are a developer, you know how important that is. But the challenge for a lot of our clients, and it becomes our challenge then, is how do you get leadership to understand the value of the developer communities that have built up around their products? It's a little bit more of a people problem, perhaps, than classic software development.
Yeah, if I can summarize, and you correct me if I'm wrong, the challenge is really around the buy-in and stakeholder engagement of what you want to build, which I think is a classic problem, that people have an idea of this would be fantastic for our customers, but you just don't have that business buy-in.
Yeah, so I'll give you an example, right? I was in a sales pitch the other day. I was at quite a large company in a specific vertical, and most of their business is actually executed via an API. So I said to one of the senior people on the call, "You're an API company." And there was a 5-minute pause, and he was there. God damn it, you're right. That's actually what we are. It's a little bit more subtle than that, though, because you can actually categorize it into two different types of businesses that we work with. One is developer first, which means that the developer starts using the product. The developer starts using the API. And I categorize, a company that lets you send email, for example, something like that, transactional email, whereas the developer that tries out the SDK, that type of stuff, and then ultimately recommends it, versus the much larger percentage of companies out there that are developer enabled, which means that there's still a classic business sales process that might be B2B or might happen in person-to-person meetings, that type of stuff. But then the actual execution and delivery of the service still involves developers on both sides building stuff. And those companies, there tend to be challenges, because once the sales people have done the deal, poor old developers suddenly have to use APIs where the documentation might be a little wanting.
It's that kind of developer-enabled business where you're seeing that buy-in because the business think that they're in a different business, kind of the customer versus the user.
If you're in the software industry, there's a lot of software companies that do this right. You might not appreciate the difficulty that exists when you're trying to integrate with vertical companies that need an API for various reasons. There's 200 million APIs as of 2024. All sorts of companies have APIs now because you need that to integrate with all sorts of different things. But if the company offering the API is not a software first company, all sorts of fun and games ensue. Don't you know there's an open banking regulation in Europe now? So banks have to provide APIs. That's super fun, right? So we have aggregators that aggregate all of these banking APIs and deal with all the variability, shall we say, in how they operate. But you can imagine that banks are not, they write a lot of software, but their leadership is not thinking about software. have their cornflakes in the morning or caviar, whatever they have for breakfast. So the challenge, it's an interesting one. We've taken a big chunk out of the world, 200 million APIs. But the digestion process has only begun, and it's pretty painful. And I'm not going to take that metaphor any further, although it's quite apt, given what comes out.
That's a brilliant example, and I think that's a common one that people would have. It's very specific to your use case of APIs, but the concept of getting that buy-in to be able to focus on the technology when the technology to a lot of the business is secondary, or they perceive it as secondary. Can you give me an example of the last time this happened, but talk about the impact? How did this make your work harder? And what was the impact of not getting that buy-in?
It increases costs on both sides, on the provider of the API and the consumer. I can think of a particular project where delivery time was probably doubled. A couple of months were easily added to the project overall until there were no more bug reports, no more issues to resolve, just because the importance of having a smooth integration wasn't really taken seriously, I would say, by either party, right? It was just assumed that the developers will just work weekends and make it happen. If there'd been more buy-in around documentation or generating examples, even maybe a webinar or two, things might have gone a bit more smoothly. Just because you don't have a big open source community doesn't mean your API doesn't have a community. I know it's more interesting to focus on the challenging side of things, but I can name names for people that have done it really well. I've worked with an Irish company called Evervault. They provide encryption as a service. And what they do that's absolutely fantastic is they have a Slack channel per engagement. A lot of companies have a shared Slack channel, but of course, it's very hard to discuss confidential information in a shared forum. But Evervault have gone to the bother of building their own Slackbot infrastructure internally so that they're actually pretty responsive.
You're not talking about building out your internal API. You're talking about doing an implementation of integrating with each individual client.
Each individual client gets a private Slack channel from Evervault.
Coming back to your problem, you said was increased cost and time doubled. I guess I'm trying to figure out the source. Is it you've designed a poor API that means that you're putting the pain on the integration?
That's a really good question. So Rory, the problem is fundamental. It's structural. Okay. I can go to ChatGPT or Stack Overflow and ask a question about the React API any day of the week, and I'll get an answer. But if I built a proprietary API that maybe only has 50 or 100 client companies using it, the community just isn't big enough. There just isn't enough material out there. So developers' usual sources of information, like Stack Overflow or even ChatGPT or Google, they're not particularly useful. So there's a huge amount of friction in just knowing how to integrate, what code to write, what examples do I get. I think the particular innovation that Evervault came up with, and you're asking about what are the challenges, that specific challenge is the implementing developers just don't know where to turn. And then they're dependent upon traditional support from the vendor. But how do you get that support? Right? Is it just documentation? Out-of-date documentation, right? Maybe if you're lucky, a sample app or two. What we've seen that's most effective is when there's some sort of interactive support. Now, Evervault with their Slack bots, you're acknowledged the second you put in a message, and then they have some sort of cool rota system where developers, as part of their day job, are assigned it. And so you're actually getting access to their senior developers, pretty much.
I'm going to jump in because I'm going to be the cold-hearted business person who says we're not a technology company. And what it sounds like is we've made the sale. That's just an implementation problem. So how is this impacting, if I am that product-enabled person, how is this making my business worse? Yes, we've passed the problem on to our customers and it is a problem there, but we've already got their money.
Have you, right? A lot of deals involve usage-based pricing. So until the usage ramps up, you ain't billing, right? And the blocker there is how quickly can the developers write the code to start using what you're offering. But even if it isn't usage-based billing, if your own support teams or internal developers keep getting dragged into conference calls to show people how to write code. That's just friction. So the per deal friction is high. The unit cost per deal is high. And that's economics 101. If you ignore the developer pain, your unit economics kind of suck, right? There is sort of hard proof that this really matters. Stripe is the hard proof. If anyone integrated with payment APIs prior to Stripe, horrible, right? Weeks and weeks of messing around and trying to get stuff to work versus Stripe where it works straight away. And guess what? They turned out to be a unicorn. I think there's hard proof that if you reduce developer friction, if you put effort into it, invest in it, it pays literal real dividends.
Who is the person who feels this the most in the company? Because your salespeople are probably happy they've got the deal. And then is it up to your development team? Is it your support team? Or in Evervolt's case, the same team because your developers are the support? Who feels the most pain?
This is a challenge, right? Because there's a bit of a disconnect here. Ultimately, of course, it's the CEO because his or her numbers suck. They don't achieve the growth that they were trying to achieve. But responsibility for this issue is highly fragmented. Because, yes, the salespeople, job done, right? Now, they might be a bit annoyed because their commissions are a bit late coming in. It's not the end of the world. And then you have customer success. It depends what metrics you have in place. If you're just seeing developers as a cost center, you're seeing customer success as a cost center as well. A lot of companies don't have joined up thinking on this. They're just going, oh, well, we have to have this. We have to have customer success.
Who's leading the charge then to fix this?
It comes back to a truism in developer relations that we found in just observing the market and with clients that we've dealt with. Unless there is high-level buy-in, and at the highest levels, literally the founder, CEO of the company, that this stuff is important. It ends up being a drag on the company that isn't organizationally understood. Not to disparage other disciplines and people who work in other areas of the business, right? But if you work in sales, you can increase your results just by adding extra hours. It's not a particularly good approach, and of course, you should be using better sales processes, et cetera, but there is a relatively direct correlation. As you know, in software, if you increase the hours, you're ultimately stacking up technical debt, and it ends up creating huge amounts of cost down the line. If you have bad documentation, every rollout takes a month extra, right? But it's not very visible, and that month extra can be reduced to only 2 weeks extra if you crack the whip hard enough and get people to work weekends. It's just not sustainable. It's a classic business problem, right? You have optimization at the edges rather than solving the fundamental problem.
A joined up system thinking of where the problem is. And in the companies that you've been working with, who is leading the charge on solving this? Because you're obviously going in there advocating for this systems approach to solving it. Who's signing your checks?
I won't mention our clients because I can't, but I will mention a really good example from a very good friend of mine. So there's a cloud hosting company called Platformatic.com, who's set up by a very good friend of mine, Matteo Kalina. If you look at how they engage with developers, Matteo is one of the founders. He's the CTO. He live codes on Twitch once a week. The thing is, from a developer perspective, you can see that that's a founding team that actually cares about developers. And if you go and use their stuff and use their APIs, it's all very slick and it all fits together really well. And there's lots of example code. And there's a community that's being nurtured. So you're not just dependent on the one company. And it's layered on top of an open source community. So it's just hitting all those developer love points that you want to hit. And why are they doing well? What's the secret? I think somebody at the C level has to have been a coder and has to have some sort of clout, right?
I guess more so in these kind of API-centric developer first versus developer enabled. Or do you feel developer enabled, it's as important?
Yeah, and ironically, I think the person who should be paying the most attention there is the CFO, because isn't it their job to pay attention to unit economics and fixed cost bases and stuff like that? And in a lot of these companies, the CFO anyway sort of ends up with responsibility for IT. IT director or whatever usually ends up reporting to them. So I'd say on a pure financial basis, there is a significant amount of cost optimization.
So jumping into what do we do about it? There are these problems. And I think this is a common problem. How you've described it is very specific to APIs and developer first products. But I think you could generalize this to being any upfront design work.
Yeah, this is an aspect of software development, but specifically is a fundamental issue, and it applies to all software projects in non-software companies.
Now, you don't need to name names, but if you can give an idea of how do you tackle this problem, because this is a fundamental problem, and unless you do it, as you say, things take double the amount of time, cost twice as much. So how do you fix it?
There are no silver bullets here. We in the software development space have to chip away at. From both ends, it's an education problem, it's a professionalism problem for us, it's an economic problem. There isn't an easy answer. And the problem, unfortunately, I see a lot of solutions to problems in software development that ultimately come down to, oh, well, you're not doing it right. That's why it failed. But at the end of the day, humans are extremely fallible. So the process has to work despite the humans. But we do have good examples. Airline safety is my go-to example for practices that we should bring into mainstream software development. Zero blame culture. Retrospectives that actually matter, that actually have an impact. So this is the lesson that we actually learned. Now let's roll it out.
How did they solve because they would have equally had this divisional mindset of, this is my area, this is my area, this is my area. But of course, the problems are across boundary.
And airplanes used to crash a lot more. I think, unfortunately, a somewhat useful forcing function, which is people dying, tends to focus the mind. But you know what? Improving the bottom line, improving profitability is also highly motivational. I think the problem there is that the forcing function isn't strong enough. A lot of companies that we work with are almost doing developer relations as a luxury. They're extremely profitable. Doing it badly doesn't hurt. And then you have startups where you either have to do it well or you die, right? But how do you change the larger number of companies in verticals that are not software, that don't have, like fintech companies have loads of money, mostly. So in a way, they can tolerate bad software development practices.
But they're losing market share dramatically, traditional banks to the new banks.
As I'm sure any bank manager will tell you, can't live on the never ever. Technical debt eventually has to be paid. But that's a long process because you have some very deep incumbents there. But I don't know, where's the forcing function for vertical companies that are making money but not serious money, and that don't have leadership that really understands this issue, and yet they find themselves with large software development teams and APIs to manage.
I love you need a crisis to change, and if you don't have a crisis, make one.
There was a crisis that I knew about. I don't know what's happened, but presumably it has been fixed in some way. In a previous life, one of the customers that we had was running their entire system off a legacy machine. And they had built a really cool API on top of it, but the fundamental process was still running on one big server. And every year or two, they would just buy bigger hardware. But as you know, Moore's Law kind of stopped a few years ago. So I really don't know. The problem was when we were interfacing with that company, the issue was very clear. The refactoring work was very clear. The fact that it had to be moved from a monolith to some sort of distributed, scalable microservice architecture was all very, very clear. And yet, in a 3 to 4 year engagement with that client where we built lots of software for them, that step was never taken.
Yeah. It's not the burning fire.
Not yet. Not this year.
Great. So I might actually just jump. Let's go back in time. You have two vastly different past lives, I would say. Nearform, which is a consultancy, and then Feed Henry, which is a product company. We've talked now about the challenge of not investing enough or not having the buy-in to make sure that the user experience of your product is high quality enough, which is going to improve a lot of things, save you time and money. Is there anything else that jumps out to you from your other experience that would be classified as you had to solve?
Feed Henry was successful. And in a way, that's because senior management did have buy-in to the user experience. What's ironic about Feed Henry is that a lot of the challenges we faced then, so this is going back 10, 15 years, the march of time and progress in software development has actually removed a lot of those challenges. We bought our own servers. We ran 20 physical servers. We were using Subversion for version control. We were on a 2-week agile cycle. The first Monday of every 2 weeks was lost to, we used to call it Merge Mondays. It's important just to pause for a minute and actually, if you look back, things have got better. You don't notice it year in, year out, but we've got rid of a lot of really horrible problems.
And was that your biggest challenge? Was it the technical part of the product development?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the Feed Henry was a 30-person startup, almost from the word go, a 30 technical person startup. It was straight into large-scale software development in a way that you just wouldn't have to these days. You wouldn't need a team to run your servers. I would say in some ways the things that we fret about and worry about come back in 10 years and they might be gone, right? I know that's not particularly helpful.
I think you're very accurate on the technical challenges that we're facing. I don't think the people challenges and the communication challenges are going away.
So maybe Nearform is more interesting there, right? Because one of the skills we developed was we were building software a lot of the time for non-technical companies, not software. Clearly, right? We're a software consultancy, so people come to us to build their software. And there's always a gap between what people want and what they need. So you might think, oh, total transparency is really, really good. We'll get the client onto all of the stand-ups and that type of stuff. But the problem with engineering is you have to discuss failure modes. You have to discuss risks, this type of thing. So if you have total transparency and you bring on somebody who's not technical, they don't sleep very well after a couple of weeks because the developers are always discussing disaster scenarios, right? There's always this challenge around how do you provide information in a way that's useful to people who don't understand the technical details? I mean, we as lay people have the same problem when it comes to medicine, right? Our doctors have to do the same thing with us. And if you take that inside an organization, how does a software development team inside an organization present their activities usefully to senior management so they can make useful decisions without scaring the bejesus out of them or acting like everything is fine and don't, ignore the man behind the curtain. And it seems to be a very soft skill that you can only pick up.
Is that really that big of a problem, though? What impacts does it cause if we just have a little bit of insular communication and we don't really do the transparency?
The biggest one is the classic issue of software projects are going great, everything's on time until the last week, and suddenly it all falls apart. And for some reason, it was due to be delivered next week and it only appears 2 months later. That's because there was no safe way to communicate a realistic perspective on where the project was. There's no silver bullets, right? Just one of the tactics that we used to use was putting a lot of effort into steering clients away from hard schedules and instead offering a lot of flexibility by saying that we would collaborate on the features. So we give the client the ability to change their minds every week and try to share the problem space. You have to build a lot of trust to do that.
That's fantastic. How do you build that trust, though? Because just saying, like, if I'm a client and I'm hearing from my consultancy, oh, let's not do hard dates, I'm hearing, I don't want to be held accountable.
Oh, yeah, billable hours. Absolutely.
Do you have any examples where you did that really successfully, and how did you do it?
Yeah, one part of it is how you interface with the external world. So Nearform was really, really good at putting our money where our mouth was in terms of supporting developers and open source communities and running events where we would get people to talk about real world challenges. It's not like the company was just a front for a lot of low-cost developers somewhere. A lot of people in the company were people that you could validate that they were actually experts. That meant that the cost base was higher. You had to pay more to get high caliber people like that. And the other one was about, I guess, the intentionality of building trust. We had this concept of something called a trust battery. And when you started engaging with a client, the job was to charge it up as quickly as possible. And that meant not overcommitting on any early stuff and being very careful about what you promised in the first couple of weeks and first couple of months. So if you said, no, we can't do X because this part will take longer, but we'll do everything else and it will be delivered on time, making sure that that was a priority.
And how effective was that?
For the most part, it worked really, really well. Because at the end of the day, you've got to remember the dynamics of a consulting project are that the project managers and the project owners, whether they be middle managers or VPs or directors or whatever, on the client side, are putting their ass on the line. because they've probably chosen you as the consultant. And they're probably internally responsible for the success of the project. So it may feel like they have lots of power by dictating whatever features they want, timelines or whatever. But actually, they're basically powerless. And you as the consultant have all of the power. And you could run rings around them if you want. And a lot of consultants do. They go for short-term gains. So another way that you build trust is by really making sure that you're empathizing with the client project owners. You're understanding the context in which they're operating. The way the software projects fail, if they end in feature fights. I don't know where I came across that term, but anyway, a feature fight is when there's a big spreadsheet and there's supposed to be a load of tick marks against the features and everybody's arguing about, is it done, is it not done? The client won't sign off until everything's ticked. Then the client starts expending tons of resources, demanding features that they don't really need. The developers start cutting loads of corners, just get them over the line. Project ends up like a silly mess, like that post office software in the UK. Right. I bet you that ended in a feature fight. And it was just get it over the line, don't care. But if you understand the dynamics of your client project owners and the pressures they are under, whether they're trying to get a promotion or there's a specific initiative that is extremely important for the business, or whether it's just about winding down an old cost center, you've got to understand that context. And then if you align with that, you can offer technical advice on what the best things to do are. It's learning by doing knowledge, right? It's tacit knowledge. A lot of the people that founded Nearform had come from a whole bunch of startups and consultancies and all that sort of stuff, right? It wasn't the first rodeo.
And do you look for anything that would help you, or did you try to figure out how do other people do this?
No, we were definitely making it up as we went along. But it was from shared pain. There was a lot of alignment around how to engage with clients and a lot of alignment around, we're not just going to dump a load of software on you, but we're really going to try to understand what are you actually trying to do here at a more fundamental level.
Your two examples, I think, are the same example, because what you've described is, and let me summarize and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but whether you're building an API, you need to think of the end customer, what they really need. Or whether you're in a consultancy, what do the users need? Not what features you're asking for, but what do the users actually need? And then your secondary thing is to convince whoever's kind of paying the bills or whoever's deciding to trust you that you are doing right by the end users and are going to build the right thing.
Exactly. There's no quick fix for doing that, right? You've got to earn it. It takes time. Does it just come back to the intent to do that? Or having a shared value system that's the approach you're going to take? It's very hard to write down a set of rules, right? Because you can't even say, be honest, because pure honesty causes freakouts and per client ends up being completely stressed out.
Did you have a look at anything along the lines of shared accountability, of trying to make people understand, instead of you being the conduit of trying to convey the problems, of trying to build their own understanding?
So I have an issue with the word accountability when it comes to business professionalism. It's not that it's a bad idea, right? And it's not that it's not necessary in many projects, but accountability is an extrinsic force on people. They're performing because they're scared or we're looking for a reward. But what you really want is intrinsic motivation, satisfaction of being a professional and delivering something professionally. A lot of people really like that, right? It's very satisfying. It's self-fulfillment.
Rather than accountability, then, in The Hard Thing About Hard Things, the book, he took the manager from each area and swapped them and just said, figure it out.
That's kind of a fun experiment. I'd forgotten he did that, yeah. It's very hard to create a culture like that when you have things like stack ranking. In a way, that's trying to formalize almost measuring for intrinsic motivation, but all it does is optimize for defensive political behavior, right? So the problem with intrinsic motivation is it's something that you have to let emerge. So you've got to let people mess up. You've got to allow people to reach that point. But what happens is once you have a critical mass of people who are working to build really good stuff for its own sake, everybody else tends to get really excited by the fact that the lack of cynicism in an environment like that, which is incredibly powerful.
Yeah, so it's back to that trust, intrinsic motivation, engaging with people. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you for sharing your background and history and stories. I hope it was insightful for you as well as for everybody. Your background speaks for itself. 3 successful companies, so you can't be doing something.
Well, two and a half. We're still working on number 3. Come back in a little while. Rory, thank you so much. Marvelous. Take care. Bye-bye.
If you'd like to know more about the ways you can remove the blocking dependencies from your processes, check out ZeroBlockers.com or follow us on your favorite social platforms.